Global governance on security is at crossroads again. The coronavirus still lurks. The Ukraine crisis has lasted for more than a year, driving up not only geopolitical tensions, but also inflation in many economies and disruption to the global supply chain. Regional tensions keep flaring up, worsening the deficits in peace and development. Many are warning that the world is faced with security challenges never seen before.
So what is the status quo, and why does the existing security architecture continue to be challenged? Can China propose the GSI, the Global Security Initiative, help achieve security for all? And hopefully this forum, hosted by CGTN and the Institute for a Community with a Shared Future at Communication University of China, could provide some clarity about these most pressing issues.
And for more insight, joining us here in the studio are Mr. Zhou Bo, Senior Colonel at the Center for International Strategy and Security at Tsinghua University, Mr. Victor Gao, Vice Chairman of Center for China and Globalization, Mr. Marco Fernandes, a Brazilian researcher at the Tricontinental Institute for Social Research.
And we're also pleased to be joined by a video link by Mr. Rick Dunham, a veteran Washington journalist and co-director of Global Business Journalism Program at Tsinghua University. We also have Mr. Jean-Christophe Bass, CEO and founder of the French think tank Connectors for Peace. Dr. Varuna Chandrakirti, principal of Eastern School of Political Studies in Sri Lanka, and Mr. Khalid Taimur Akram, Executive Director of Pakistan Research Center for a Community with a Shared Future. Thank you so much for joining us on our forum.
So let's get straight to it. Mr. Zhou, do you think the UN-centered post-Second World War world order is at risk now? If that's the case, do you think it's been abused or bullied by unilateralism?
Well, I think you're right, because the world really has totally changed. German Chancellor Olaf Scholz talked about Zeitenwende, the turning point in Germany. But actually, for all of us, the world is totally divided. But about the order itself, I think it's a big question, because I never believe there is anything like the liberal international order, because the order now, as in the past, is almost the same thing. It is composed of different social systems, religions, national identity, food and culture, so on and so forth. Some of these have not changed even in millennium. So to just describe the post-Second World War order as a liberal international order is at least simplistic, because these orders certainly are composed of the rules and regime that are mostly built by the West. But the rules and regime in economic fields themselves cannot constitute the whole international order.
So, Mr. Dunham, do you think the liberal world order and all the security problems it has caused is a delusion as put forward by your American peer, Mearsheimer?
I don't think delusion is the right word. I think that the post-World War II architecture of the world is out of date. I mean, it's nearly 80 years old, and it was created for a world that was bipolar in a different way, with communism and capitalism, with the Soviet Union and the United States as the polar opposites. I mean, I think we're at least in the third, quote, world order of that period. The post-Cold War era, after the fall of communism in Russia, and now the third one, where the unipolar power of the United States is no longer is no longer alone. And you have China as a rising power, you have Europe collectively is assertive, and you have the global South, which is much more important in terms of population, in terms of market, and in terms of desire for more input in the world.
Well, we are a year now into the conflict in Ukraine, and of course how major powers view and engage in this conflict are also being carefully studied, because they could have the potential to change the course of history. I want to ask you this, Mr. Zhou Bo, you attended the Munich Security Conference. So what would you say about the future direction of the conflict there, based on the messages from the key players?
Well, at least this year, nobody knows how this war could actually last. I mean, this war definitely will not end in this year. And according to my impression in Munich Security Conference, when people like Ukrainian President Zelensky or British Prime Minister Sunak talking about providing assistance to Ukraine, or the need for providing assistance to Ukraine, or people just give big hands. So the atmosphere there is Ukraine, Ukraine, Ukraine. Nobody is talking about seizing support or looking for ceasefire. And nobody is talking about neutrality, because even the chairman of the conference made it clear, we're not here for neutrality. We just want to give political support to Ukraine. So even in the beginning, a piece of piano is played by the Ukrainian to just give a kind of atmosphere. But the deep, under the surface, I believe people are totally divided, because if a war knows no ending, it gives the people uncertainty. And this is why it is important for Chinese the Councillor Wang Yi to turn up to talk about China's upcoming proposal. This proposal now is already clear. It is full of general principles. Some critics say it is short of a roadmap, but don't underestimate that, because when Chinese people start the reform and opening them up, we do not have a roadmap. And Chinese people are good at finding a road without a map. And so is Belt and Road Initiative. It is 10 years old. And 10 years ago, who knows that now this would become a phrase familiar with the whole world. So I believe Chinese roadmap will simply follow up with a lapse of time.
There will be more specifics coming up. And also, as you mentioned, China released its own version of the peace plan on the one-year mark of this conflict. But then over the past year, it has not supported Moscow in UN votes, it has not provided Russia with weapons, and it has repeatedly claimed neutrality. But why, Mr. Bas, why does this Chinese stance on the conflict in Ukraine being perceived otherwise by the West?
Of course, there's lots of, in a way, confusion, and we have seen so many things happening in the last months that, of course, any new attempt, to contribute to peace or at least to dialogue is certainly welcome. And in that respect, I think that the plan that was put forward a few days ago by China is certainly welcome. There is, of course, a big question mark, and I speak from a European perspective. There is a question mark, or let's say, lots of people who are puzzled, to see that China, who could have played or who could still play a major role in, let's say, accelerating the peace process, has been in a way, I don't mean hesitating or not really taking an active part, which, in a way gives to China an opportunity to play a key role as a peacemaker. And evidently, if there is a key and proactive role played by China with the two countries, with Russia and Ukraine, I believe that China can play a key role. And it's interesting, actually, to see that even so, most of the Western countries express some sort of skepticism vis-à-vis the Chinese plan. It's interesting to see that President Zelensky has expressed openness and interest in discussing this plan, and also in meeting with President Xi. So hopefully this can mark the start of, I don't mean a negotiating process, because evidently we are not there yet, but at least the beginning of a dialogue. And I wrote a piece a few months ago on the China Daily, where my recommendation or my statement was exactly this: that China can play a tremendous role in a way brokering a peace process, or at least a negotiation and a dialogue. So there is a real window of opportunity now.
Also make or break time for the Global South, Mr. Fernandez and Mr. Akram. Mr. Fernandez, please.
Yeah, I believe so. I believe that Global South is also emerging as a political actor in the global stage. But the problem we have now, and this is why GSI is so important, is that right now United Nations is no longer a place where the countries have any compliance about their acts. So, I mean, just one example, we're talking about the Cold War. At the end of the Cold War, everybody expected that, oh, now we're going to have a more peaceful planet, but actually it was the opposite. If you take the numbers, 200 years before the end of the Cold War, which means 1991, 200 years before that, United States did 218 military operations, like this is officially, numbers from US, 218 operations in the world. From 1991, the end of the Cold War and end of the Soviet Union, until this last year, US organized 251 military operations. And some of them, or I would say a big part of them, without any compliance or any agreement in the in the Security Council of the United Nations. So I think this is one of the issues that for the next years is going to be one of the biggest challenges, how to create compliance to the members of the United Nations. Because even what's happening now, I mean, of course, I mean, everybody knows, and even like many US officials had warned United States government, from Henry Kissinger to John Mearsheimer, that NATO should not expand to the east. This will create problems, and now we have a war. Or what happened recently with Nord Stream 2. I mean, there was an attack, a terrorist attack against Nord Stream 2, and there's no compliance. Nobody, I mean, there's no investigation. Russia denounced, China denounced, many other countries denounced, but there's no compliance. So again, and by the way, it's interesting that to see that the article of Simon Hirsch, the very famous journalist, accusing U.S. government of this attack, it was published just 4 days after the creation of this Chinese spy balloon story from Western media, which is a great smoking what is it called? Smoking screen, right? Mm-hmm. So, I mean, this is the kind of situation that we are dealing now. So we hope that GSI, together with the Global South countries, can be a step in a way to deal with this challenge, the challenges that we have in the next years.
Yeah, well, any war, any regional conflict, they go beyond just security challenges. They exposed us of a wide range of differences in terms of systematic structure and political stances, as well as economic conditions. Dr. Gao, what would you say about China's involvement in some of the major events, pivotal events going on in the world?
Well, I think as far as China is concerned, there are several things of crucial importance. One is to preserve peace. Then secondly, to defend and preserve stability at home. Because without peace, many countries will be plunged into chaos. And without domestic stability, you cannot talk about sustainable economic development. So all these things are actually correlated. You are talking about international peace, domestic stability, economic growth and development, for example, everything in each country, in all continents, for example, they should be correlated. However, you talked about the international order as established after the winning against the Nazi Germany and imperialist Japan at the end of the Second World War. I truly believe we are still living in that international order as established in 1945. I don't think China has any incentive to abolish that international order. China was one of the founders of that order. China had lived throughout these decades, and China benefited hugely from being an integral part of that order. But the problem with that order now is that there is one particular big country which wants to put itself on top of the rest of the world. It wants to impose its values and its ideology onto other countries. It deems itself as an overlord, if not a god, for example. How can other countries live in a world accepting a subjugated position than this overlord position?
And as you just mentioned, the sense of insecurity has prompted countries to increase their spending on military budget. For example, we have put up the numbers for you here. The U.S., for example, is increasing its military spending by 10% to $858 billion US dollars, and India by 13%. And also, we are seeing Japan increasing its military budget by 20%, China by 7.2%.
And the 2%, we have to mention that it's kind of a threshold figure stipulated by the NATO treaty itself. But for the past several decades, many countries were lagging behind. But due to all the recent events in Europe and maybe globally, many countries are now picking up. So having said that, let's take a closer look at the very concept, essence and vision of the GSI, Global Security Initiative. Mr. Akram, earlier we were talking about the Global South, and Mr. Gao also emphasized that war or peace is a choice for us all on this planet. But I really want to talk about non-traditional security challenges and its impacts on the Global South or the developing countries. How pressing is the issue, and how important is China's GSI to deal with all those non-traditional security challenges? Because the very first commitment made by the GSI is staying committed to the vision of common, comprehensive, cooperative and sustainable security.
Yes, thank you very much. I totally agree with Professor Dr. Victor Gao, whatever he has said. And before going to the non-traditional security threat aspect, I would just like to add one thing over here, because I belong to a country which is mostly affected from terrorism since last 20 years. So if we talk about the performance of United States and NATO countries in this part of the world, we have seen what they have done in Afghanistan. Once the Americans and the NATO forces, they invaded Afghanistan in 2001, after 9/11, there were only 2 terrorist organizations in Afghanistan. But once they left in 2021, on 15th August 2021, they had left 44 terrorist organizations in Afghanistan. So I totally agree with this notion that Americans, wherever they have gone, they have left a legacy, they have left a mark which has affected not only that country, but also the neighboring countries. As you know, that Pakistan had been suffering a lot from terrorism, and more than 80,000 people have died since last 15, 16 years. And now this is the time that the countries must look forward towards this GSI, which the Chinese President Xi Jinping has suggested to the failed Security Council of the United Nations, because we have seen that the Security Council would only take up those matters which they would like to take up, and otherwise they do not take up the matters. We have seen the issue of Palestine, we have seen the issue of Kashmir, the occupied Kashmir, and we have seen, you have just shown the amount of defense spending which India has started doing. So now coming over to the non-traditional security threats, I totally agree with this thing that the non-traditional security threats are affecting our region, especially the Euro-Asian region. We have seen the climate change. Last summer, Pakistan was again one of the most affected countries from the climate change. And I personally feel that this global security initiatives would greatly help the countries in coming together on the non-traditional security threats like food security, climate change, and other affectees. Personally feel that the GSI would not only create a conducive environment for all the countries, but it is a vision in which the countries can sit together and talk about it. Very recently, we have seen a great model given by Chinese, again by the Chinese initiative, which is the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, which has proved out to be a very, very successful model in this part of the world. And because of that model, we have seen countries coming together. And now I think that because of this GSI, the countries would again sit together and talk about it and implement it.
Dr. Waruna, what's your take on the root causes of security challenges, or let's face it, conflicts, military scenarios all around the world? Do you think it's simply because of caused by deterrence or other deep-rooted problems such as poverty, illegal migration, even violent crimes, and all those multinational problems like mentioned by Mr. Akram there? Climate change and all those food security problems. How pressing is the issue for developing countries and less developed countries?
As I think, it is not something related to this poverty or environment. These are also global security problem. I know the poverty and so many other things, environmental issues and climate change and so many other things. But this main security problem coming from these military powers, especially from the West, that UK and USA, they are the leading countries, always making trouble around the world. Then, as I think, this is a cultural problem. That means they are representing that one particular culture. It has some roots from this Viking. There's Scandinavia, that countries that this Viking culture, they have one we call something called that the Viking age. They origin this Viking culture, and they have this habit of bullying other people and always taking other resources for their use, and they want to dominate all over the world. It is totally different from the Chinese side. We know China and then even the Sri Lanka, we are Buddhist country. We always talking about something that we prefer to see a kind of harmonious world. We don't want to invade other countries or other nations. We want to rob other people's resources because it is our cultural background. We are cultured in this way. We have been cultured in this way. But the people in the West, especially in the UK and USA, they have their own way of reacting, that the way of doing something. This is what happened. Even we see the last 500 years ago, and even the last 200 years ago, what they did, they are still doing the same thing. Now they are using some different other methods, but they are still doing these things. The whole wars started from that side, not these other people. Other people fighting to escape from from them. That's what happened. This is what I think. This root cause is the culture of those people.
Gentlemen, this community that Chinese authorities have envisioned really allows us to examine what holds people together. And if we look at it from a security perspective, it points to the very existential need. So, Mr. Jobo, help us understand the intrinsic design, the intrinsic logic behind this design.
Well, I think under President Xi Jinping's general thoughts, of course, it's humanity of shared future. But now we already have two pillars on it, that global development initiative and global security initiative. And I would say that these two pillars are just like two wings, because we already have something very tangible under it. For example, the global development initiative, we have a Belt and Road initiative. This is not just an initiative. Actually, it is already spread across the world. And it's remarkable to think that this proposal actually comes from the largest developing country on earth. So it's not a Marshall Plan. It's actually the biggest plan coming from a developing country. But then under this pillar of global security initiative, we have already seen something. Talking about the PLA, two things are most remarkable. One is China's peaceful rise, which of course has a lot of things to do with its armed forces, right? So apart from a deadly brawl between China and India, which resulted in 20 soldier deaths and 4 Chinese soldiers' deaths, actually China's rise is absolutely peaceful. Then talking about PLA's operation overseas, be it peacekeeping, counter-piracy, or disaster relief, you actually have a common name for all these operations. That is a military operation other than war. Professional speaking, that is called mutua. So this is important because why? PLA apparently is growing with strength. And but for PLA, to actually safeguard its interest overseas, and showed its greater international responsibility. PLA is just confined to humanitarian area, and I hope even if we become one of the strongest military in the world, then we will still stick to this principle. Because with this principle, you're not killing anyone, you're not bombing anyone. So you make a difference from all the strong militaries in the world, in the history. And that makes PLA different, and that makes China different.
Well, for any power, for any country, of course, their security priority is national defense. But then for major powers, there are often added meanings and expectations. So now let's take a look at the Global Security Initiative, how it was released. It was proposed by China. China's President Xi Jinping proposed this Global Security Initiative at the Boao Forum in April last year. And the speech was notable because it is the first time China has hinted at its readiness for a new approach to global security with Chinese characteristics. The initiative has settled on 6 commitments: a commitment to a comprehensive, cooperative, and sustainable security, respect for the sovereignty and territorial integrity of all countries, abiding by the principles of the United Nations Charter, and taking seriously the legitimate security concerns of all countries, peacefully resolving disputes through dialogue, and maintaining security in both traditional and non-traditional domains. So these are certainly China's solutions to the pressing security issues facing our world today. And of course, this sense of building a community with a shared future for mankind is embedded in almost every single foreign policy outreach by China. So Dr. Gao, what does traditional Chinese wisdom and judgment have to offer in this regard?
Well, I think several things stand out very prominently. One is achieving harmony. Harmony between nations, among nations, harmony between mankind versus nature. So we are talking about harmony in a macro way and permeating to everything that groups of countries or groups of nations would do, as well as what Homo sapien will deal with nature in itself. Now, the other principle I put a premium on is what Confucius said. Don't do unto others what you do not want others do unto you. And this means that every country need to respect each other. And if you have differences, try to solve the differences in peaceful negotiations and diplomacy rather than resorting to war. War should be the last resort. And war is easy to launch, difficult to end. And even if you end the war, there will be huge consequences, not only for the present, but probably for the next generations. Therefore, I think China stands firmly for defending peace and maintaining stability, and is a firm force opposing war of all kinds in the world. And if there is a war breaking out somewhere in the world, China wants to stand by the side of peace. China wants to urge all parties involved to complete a ceasefire, to draw a line of actual control, and then to negotiate, try to solve whatever disputes they may have in between themselves. In this way, I would say what China stands for is consistent with the Chinese philosophy over the past several centuries. That is peace, stability, harmony, and don't use war as the first choice, always use war as a last choice. And if you can achieve your goal without having a war, it will be much better. Peaceful means will always trump wars and confrontations.
Yeah, there's certainly some clashing views about security. For example, the China proposed Global Security Initiative, and the Western view of geopolitical tensions. Mr. Bas, I want to get your views on this. What are the major differences between these two very different kinds of views in terms of security?
Well, let me just start with an anecdote. I wanted to prepare our discussion last night, and I went to consult a few old books, and I realized that it is only 20 years that Kishore Mahbubani has published this very fascinating and somewhat provocative book that was called Can Asians Think? And it's interesting to see that in less than 20 years, we are living in a world that is radically different, where indeed, we have witnessed some sort of tectonic changes, and where indeed Asian and particularly China is playing a major role in contributing not only new ideas, but with this global security initiative, with some sort of a blueprint or a plan for, let's say, reinventing the world order. And I think this is absolutely key. And to be frank, and I feel a little bit ashamed to see that in Europe, there is very little or almost no discussion about this GSI. I mean, if you ask people or even experts, very few of them know about this GSI. Maybe because it came at a very wrong time, just a few weeks after the start of the invasion in Ukraine, and that it didn't get all the visibility. It is also because, in a way, most of the observers or influencers or decision makers in Europe, they pay much more attention to their own vision rather than listening to the other. And it's interesting to see that when President Xi came up about 10 years ago with the plan for the Belt and Road Initiative, it took lots of time, before it got some traction and interest in Europe or in the Western world. And I think we see the same here. But I mean, what is interesting is that China and President Xi have tabled this plan, which evidently is an attempt, to reinvent the global order. And I think, the role and the responsibility and the duty now of Americans, Europeans, but also the rest of the world is to come up with their own plan and own vision, and also in a way to enter in a dialogue. And what I think is that we evidently, when I say we as Westerners, have been somewhat in a way either lazy or in a denial of this new reality. We are living in a world that is evidently very different to the world that it was before. And that we see, the emerging South, we see the emerging countries, but we are still considering that there is no need or there is no reason to change the system where we are. And evidently, it is time now to reinvent the multilateral or the global order where we are. And I think, the time has come to call for, what could be called a new Bretton Woods moment, or really to a total aggiornamento, to say, okay, we just cannot continue if we want to maintain a peaceful and prosperous world in all parts of the world, in the north, in the south, in the east, and in the west. We need now to sit around the table and agree on, first on how to disagree, which is a part of the journey, because we cannot agree on everything. And I think, what Rick Dunham just said before is true. We have everywhere values and beliefs that we consider are right and that we want to, in a way, to make them prevail. But this needs a real discussion. And I think, sometimes or very often, the approach from Westerners have been wrong lately. I think when it comes to some of the values, being whatever, democracy, gender, whatever, we need to protect them from our perspective. We want to propagate them, but we certainly don't want and don't need to impose them. And I think this was, the approach was to say, we consider that those values are the right and the exclusive one, and this is the wrong approach. So protect, promote, but certainly not impose. And we need now, because we are in a world that will be, with multiple actors, we need to, to try to build some sort of a new momentum and a new blueprint, to see on what we agree, what we disagree, where we want to cooperate. And in a way, this is a unique moment in time to reinvent in a way, a global order that will be fair, balanced, and sustainable.
Yeah, I'm afraid the tricky thing about the very idea of security that it's not purely philosophical or metaphysical. And on the other side, on the opposite, it's a matter of life and death to every one of us. So since Mr. Barth raised this question, Mr. Zhou, what could be the common denominator for human being to actually reach some kind of consensus?
Well, this is barely possible. At least on the war of Ukraine, it's very difficult for us to reach a consensus because nowadays Europeans simply talk about what is going on and how much casualty has been caused, which is correct, right? But people forgot to talk about the root causes of why this war actually came into being at all. Because if you read the history, well, it's not a long history, you would find that actually from Soviet Union onto Russia. So from Soviet leaders, Mikhail Gorbachev, down to Boris Yeltsin, down to President Putin, they have invariably warned against such kind of NATO expansion. But what makes President Putin different from his predecessor? He not only gave warning, he carried it into action. And that is his difference from his predecessor. Whether he's right or not, that will be left to history to make a judgment. But now I want to talk about the military alliance. You know, military alliances, big or small, have one thing in common. They live on threat because they are like leeches. They drink blood. What is the blood? The blood is so-called threat. And after the dissolution of the Soviet Union, actually the mission of NATO is already over. But NATO, as such a juggernaut, still want to not only survive, but thrive. And how can such a juggernaut thrive? It has to expand. So military alliance basically have to live on threat. But NATO has a problem. Why? Because if it is a bunch of small countries united against a big threat, I totally understand. But for the strongest nations on earth, with 3 nuclear weapon states among them, would come into alliance against what? That is a big question. And if you read the website of NATO, you would find military means are just tools. The first purpose is to defend Western democracy. So this is actually a behavior of holding a big stick in hand and chanting democracy. And that is the very purpose. But now NATO has driven it to almost the threshold of a nuclear war. So it actually has been digging its own tomb. Then about the security of the whole European continent. You can say, of course, NATO is not forcing anybody to join NATO. Of course, these small countries are afraid of Russia, wants to join. All these are correct. But the question is, the security of Europe eventually would depend on compromise between Russia and NATO, like it or not. Yeah, if there is no compromise between NATO and Russia, Europe will never be safe. It will be always in chaos.
So are you implying that seeking common security is such a huge task that requires you to be an idealist and realist at the very same time, and also seeking a methodology, a feasible methodology, as raised earlier, a question raised by Mr. Donham. Mr. Fernandez, do you see a way out here?
Well, it's not going to be easy. First of all, I think, agreeing with Mr. Gao, that the principles of GSI are very clear. If you see the points, China is always saying, okay, we're gonna support the efforts of the countries. We need to sit in dialogue. It's a very comprehensive also document. Of course, we need much more discussion, but it's reaching a lot of issues right now in the world. But the problem is that first of all, it's not easy at this point to have dialogue because of all the conflicts that we have in the world. I don't know if you saw, but recently the European Council of Foreign Relations, they published a research they have done in both Europe, United States, but also major countries like India, China, Turkey, and Russia. For these 4 countries of the Global South, that represents 3 billion people in the world, it's almost half of the planet, the majority of people feels that we should stop the war right now, even if this means some compromises from Ukraine, of course from Russia, but mostly from Ukraine. So this is almost the majority of the planet saying that. But it's really hard to get consensus when, for instance, China launched not only GSI, as Professor Ba said, nobody's paying attention to this, but also when China raised the 12 points for the peaceful solution in Ukraine, I mean, United States and Europe, they first reacted, say, no, we don't agree with that. Even if Zelensky said he is willing to talk with President Xi Jinping, and of course, Russia is also saying the same. So, so at this point, it's really hard because looks like the other side, the Western side, is not willing to compromise anything. And again, if we think about who are the Global South countries, what is the role of Global South countries right now in the world? I mean, if you get BRICS, for instance, if you get GDP for at PPP index, China is the largest economy. India is the third. Russia is the sixth, and Brazil is the eighth. So we're talking about major countries, major global actors that are not having a voice in this discussion. That's why also President Lula from Brazil recently also joined these efforts to create a sort of a G20 for the peaceful solution in Ukraine. But again, if the Western side, and especially US, is not able to sit and compromise and listen to the other side, it's going to be very difficult to reach some sort of consensus. And this is urgent for the whole planet because, I mean, the war is taking so many lives and is affecting the economy, is affecting the price of energy, that skyrocketing, the food prices, the fertilizers prices. So millions of people are going back into poverty in Africa, in Latin America, in Asia because of the war. So it's very urgent. But again, we need some compromise from both sides.
Yeah, let's now shift our attention now to the Middle East. We know that region is also scarred by wars, conflicts, and political uncertainties, and it's believed to be one of the regions in the world with the largest security deficit and development deficit. And during President Xi Jinping's visit there last year, there were agreements to expand military as well as security ties between the two sides. So how would you evaluate, Mr. Gao, China's willingness and capability in terms of filling those gaps? And how does this involvement look like to the rest of the world?
Well, if we are talking about China-Saudi Arabian relations, China-Gulf state relations, and China-Arabic countries relations, three different layers of things, I would say the summit meeting last year between President Xi Jinping of China and all these countries' leaders actually went to huge, great success, unprecedented, and very rare on the global stage. And I think it reinforces several messages. One is that China has sincerity in its mind. China wants to hold its hand out to reach all these countries, which China considers very important. Then China does not have a vested interest, for example, of picking sides, supporting one country versus another country, for example. China can be friends with, let's say, Saudi Arabia on the one hand, but also Iran on the other hand. China can be a great friend of Israel on the one hand, but a staunch supporter of Palestine on the other hand. China has this flexibility of positions, and China always wants to see, what do you want? What do you want from me, for example, and how can we really reciprocate each other's strengths and complement each other? Now, I think this spirit is really very, very different from other countries, for example, which tend to walk into the room, use its sharp elbows to brush out other sides, put itself in the center, and then try to impose its vision, its view, its political system, its ideology, or its values onto other countries, in the belief that the other countries are weak, the other countries are enfeebled, and the other countries will have no way but just to become subjugated to the overwhelming position of this superpower. I don't think this is the right way going forward. I don't think any country in the world wants to be subjugated to any country, big or small, which claims itself to be the overlord of the world. I think China's promotion of multilateralism, that is, everyone is equal, everyone has a chance, no one should be left out, and your dignity doesn't depend on whether you are big in size or small in size. Your dignity is ensured once you are a sovereign country in the world, and the UN Charter should be applicable to you, regardless of whether you are very developed or very backward, whether very strong, very weak, very big, very small. I think the world is more eager to listen to this vision from China, talking about equality and multilateralism, talking about the UN Charter, and prohibiting any country holding itself as if it is the overlord for other countries or for mankind.
Well, having said that, Mr. Donovan, do you think the GSI is heavily underreported in Western media? And let's expand the scope a little bit. Do you think over-dominance of the international information flow could be a destabilizing factor itself?
Those are very, very good questions. And yes, it is fair to say that this is underreported. Just look at how many stories there have been or there have not been in American media, in Western Europe. I would even argue in a lot of Asia. It has not been reported significantly on in much of East Asia, more in Southeast Asia and South Asia. I do think that there is, we have a fractured global media, and we have fractured media within the United States, where you have very partisan media, right-wing media, sort of nonpartisan media, and liberal media. But it is a problem in that, as you can see from the different viewpoints that you have here, and you have a nice collection of people from around the world, that there are many perspectives. And if the information people get is from one perspective and to the absence of the other, it's not good. I mean, it's always good for people to get as many different points of view as possible, as factually as possible, and then decide for themselves. So I think you've touched on important points. I don't have a good answer on how to get there, but the more we have these discussions, the better. And let me take another point, the Belt and Road Initiative. That was really underreported for a long time, and eventually in non-Chinese media, there was some negative coverage as well as positive coverage. But I do say, as it became more and more covered, it forced a response from the United States, from Japan, from Europe, to develop certain plans for infrastructure around the world. So whatever we say about the coverage being biased or not biased, enough or not enough, it eventually is a good thing, because we now have many countries in the world who want to help developing countries with infrastructure. So I think that this is a first step. I think we will have more discussion of global security initiative over time, and let's just see what happens. I mean, the idea is get everyone's voice out there, have a robust debate, and let people decide. But let's move forward and actually talk about it.
Indeed, and maybe it's not too late to recall that report issued by the McBride Committee in the early 80s, endorsed by the UN, one world, many voices. And having said that, Dr. Waruna, how difficult would it be to translate common security in a transcultural way?
I think that the most important thing is now, they have this cultural problem, they are side, but we cannot correct them. It is not our way of doing something. They should have their own culture. We can't change their culture, but we can enrich our culture. We can empower our people. This is the only way we can face their threat. That means what they want to try. They try to do. Even we know when the China, that new China was established in 1949, the People's Republic didn't have much military resources, hard power, and other things. But still, People Republic could face the threat of the USA and UK and other Western powers. Why? Because the people had the power. When people is powerful, it is very easy to face this kind of problem. It is not even Sri Lanka is a small country, but still we can face such a problem, such a threats. It is not a big issue. Therefore, I think most important thing is that empower the people and enrich the culture. This is the only way of solution. Only way. Then we have our people, our culture. You have your people and your culture. And the African countries, they have their own people and strong people and their culture. Then we can face this issue very easily. That is what we call the one world, many voices. Otherwise, we don't have any voice. If we are not strong, we don't have any voice. How China get the voice? Because China could make itself very strong. It is the way, no other way. This is what I think.
Right. Although this is called a global security initiative, but China is not seeking dominance through such an initiative. And let's also remember, China is the world's largest developing country. I'm talking about the need and demands for the developing world in all. So, Mr. Akram, what do you make of the methodology you're expecting from the GSI? Because we know Pakistan is also a major developing country.
Yes, let me first give you the example of Belt and Road Initiative. Actually, once the Belt and Road Initiative it started, many of the Western countries and Western media, it propagated that it is a way that China will colonize the world. So, but eventually after 10 years, we saw that China did not colonize the world, but China helped the world in development, in making infrastructure. So now, yes, GSI, as the other speakers said, that GSI is the least reported news in the media, especially in the Western media. This needs to be worked on, and this needs to be spread in various parts of the world, not only through English media, but through other regional medias and through various languages. Pakistan is a developing country, and Pakistan is very much part of the Belt and Road Initiative because we have the flagship project CPAC. And let me share over here with the audience that because of the CPAC in last 7-8 years, we have seen an immense change in the livelihood of the people. The road infrastructure throughout the country has immensely improved. Skilled labor has got lots of opportunities for the jobs. So the CPAC has come to Pakistan as a blessing, and we consider that because of the CPAC now, we are also connected to the landlocked countries of the Central Asia. Although we are neighbors with Tajikistan, Uzbekistan, and with other landlocked countries since long. But since last 30 years, ever since these countries got independence from former Soviet Union, we did not had any kind of road link with them. But now the road link is developed thanks to the Belt and Road corridors and the CPAC. So this GSI is very much important, not only for Pakistan, but also for this region, because we know that Afghanistan is a place which is a flashpoint not only for Pakistan, but also for rest of the world. We have seen the failed American and NATO policy in Afghanistan, but at the same time, we have seen China playing a very decisive role, because ever since the Taliban government has come into power in Afghanistan, China has been playing the role of stabilization. Chinese role is not only acknowledged by people in Pakistan, but I have been talking to various Afghan leaders and Afghan think tanks. They also acknowledge the role of China in the post 15th August 2021 scenario. So the global security initiatives will not only bring peace to this region, but will also be a win-win situation, especially talking about Afghanistan, because for us right now, not only for us, but for China and for all the Central Asian countries, the major flashpoint remains of Afghanistan. And unfortunately, since last 2 years, we have seen that United Nations has not played any kind of role in stabilizing the situation of Afghanistan. So this GSI can act as a stabilizer, because if we see the 6 parts of this GSI, one of the most important part which I consider is that stay committed to respecting the sovereignty and territorial integrity of all the countries. This is very, very important, because if we only take this part, it means that China considers sovereignty of all the countries very, very important, which unfortunately is not considered important by a few of the Western countries. So I strongly hope that GSI can play a stabilizing role for Afghanistan and can bring peace in South Asia.
Yeah, well, countries around the world are now watching out for the specifics and the implementation of the GSI. And in the government work report just delivered during China's most important political season of the year, authorities say that China stands ready to work with the international community to put this concept paper into action. And Mr. Zhou Bo, what do you think will be the priorities for the GSI going forward?
Well, GSI certainly is not only about China, but about the rest of the world. So if we look into the future, I hope PLA would just follow what it has been doing so far. That is just to get yourself involved in humanitarian assistance to the world. In that regard, you're not a killer. You're a good Samaritan. You provide assistance to people around the world. And that role will make China profoundly different from all other countries and would put PLA fundamentally different from all other armed forces. So why not think of China now? China doesn't need any spheres of influence. Why? Because China's influence is already ubiquitous around the world. Therefore, China doesn't need any specific spheres of influence. But you have 2 things overseas as a major power. Major power is different from small power in that it does not only have a territory to safeguard, but it also has overseas interest. It also has your international responsibilities, being a major power. Therefore, that is why we see, for example, Chinese counterparty operation in the Gulf of Aden. So Chinese Navy has been combining these 2 together almost in a perfect way. Because when PLA Navy sent out its flotillas to the Gulf of Aden by the end of 2008, the only mission is to safeguard Chinese ships and to provide protection to the ships of the World Food Program. They are limited, but it ends up with Chinese flotillas spending half of its time, escorting all the ships that actually is basically half and half, foreign ships and Chinese ships. So this is something we have never envisioned before. But I'm most happy with this because it shows how China could actually manage to blend all these responsibilities, that is national interest and international responsibility, all together. And that for me is an ideal PLA Navy in the blue water.
Thank you very much, gentlemen. Thank you all for your insights. As states vie for their interest in a rapidly evolving geopolitical climate, we need to recognize that all those issues are best addressed through cooperation and dialogue.
Well, Chinese President Xi Jinping said countries around the world are like passengers aboard the same ship who share the same destiny. We need to work together to maintain peace and stability in the world.
And that's where, why, and how the Global Security Initiative comes to its making.
And we'd like to thank our panel for sharing their insights with us. As security and development go hand in hand, so CGTN will host another forum on the world's most pressing development issues and the possibilities China has to offer. Stay tuned for that. Thanks for watching.